Right, welcome back everybody after lunch. Looks like we have a lively session ahead of us now, just based on the chat we've been having. So this session, I was really pleased to see it on the programme when I saw that we were going to be discussing diversity of women's lived experience. And this picks up on some of the questions we were starting to have in the last session. Who are we? Who are we talking about when we say we? How, when economists model, are they even modelling for the impact on women, but also thinking about what that means for older women, younger women, women in different social groups, women from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So we need to have a much richer discussion here. We need to start, of course, by filling up those spaces and talking about the invisible women, but we also need to have a much richer discussion about that diversity of experience. So that's what we're going to be talking about now with our great panellists. We're going to go in the order that's on the programme. We'll start with Lisa Mckenzie at Middlesex University, who has done some great work, main interview-based, that you're going to talk about, working with working class communities in East London and in Nottinghamshire, where you're from. And we've just established that this is a non-metropolitan panel in terms of our original background. That's a good thing. So I think that really picks up on some of the discussions we were just starting to have in that last session before lunch. We'll then go on to, just making sure I've got it in the right order, Rachel Minto, who's done a lot of work on what those gender policies mean, gender mainstreaming. And again, we were starting to ask questions about that. What does that mean at European level? And then also is doing a lot of work now on thinking about the UK in the context of devolution, and is working on policy in Wales, which you'll be telling us about. And then we have Vivienne Hayes, who heads up the Women's Resource Centre and who is on the front line and knows what is happening. So she's been studying this, looking at some of these reports that have been focusing on the impact on women of austerity and Brexit, among other political events, but is also there on the front line and seeing it with your own eyes. And I know from having shared a platform with Vivienne earlier this year that she is a very impassioned speaker. So looking forward to all of these contributions. We'll start with you, Lisa.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I mean, I'm beginning to sort of be invited to quite a lot of things on Brexit at the moment, and it's because I wrote 2 academic papers which included interviews and data that I collected with a group of women in the East End of London when I was doing research. I'm an ethnographer. For those of you who don't know what an ethnographer is, it's a research methodology where you are embedded in the community where you research. The first research that I did was in St Anne's in Nottingham, where I lived, and it was with women. It was with white working class women whose children were mixed race, and it was about their life living on a council estate in Nottingham. The next piece of research I did, is because I'd moved to London, was with a group of women in Bethnal Green. And obviously this started, and that ethnography can go on for a long time. As an ethnographer, I tend to think that the work that I do is in-depth and real research, because I don't survey anybody. I don't spend a day with someone and think that I know something. I'm there for years. The sad thing about ethnography really is it's expensive, and it's never really properly funded. But what you get out of that ethnography, out of spending a lot of time with one small group of people in a setting, is a really in-depth understanding of what's happening there. So I started this research in 2013. What's that got to do with Brexit? Well, nothing, because we didn't know he was on the scene now. And actually my research was never about Brexit at all, and it still isn't. It's about working class people's lives. And I met this group of women. I actually met one of the women, Sally, in the housing office in Bethnal Green. She'd just been made homeless and she was trying to get somewhere to live. She didn't find anywhere to live and she ended up moving back in with her mum, so it was her mum and her 2 children in a 1-bedroom flat in Bethnal Green, because there's just the other option was for her, the only other option was to be sent to Liverpool. And she refused to go, and so therefore had made herself intentionally homeless. So the council had sort of washed their hands over her. So she went to live with her mum, and she introduced me to her friends. So what we were doing is just sort of meeting up, and I was just sort of doing things with them, having coffee, having a laugh, going to I got invited to sort of christenings, Christmas parties, that sort of thing. And that's what you do as an ethnographer. And so what the conversations that we had from 2013 to 2017, when I stopped that research, was really wide. And in that time, from 2013 to 2017, I think we had something like 4 elections. Because had local elections, and in Tower Hamlets in Bethnal Green we had to have a re-election, and there was something like 4 or 5 elections. It was really odd in that time. And obviously as each election came up and people were talking about politics, one of the things I was talking about with this group of women was politics, and they were never interested. They said to me, this doesn't affect us. This is not about us. This is about somebody over there. And even though Bethnal Green is only 3 miles away from Westminster, it may as well have been the other side of the country, because the women had no connection to it at all. They didn't know really their MP was. They'd not really thought about going to their MP to ask for support or ask for help. And the local elections, they really felt totally disconnected to the local elections. They said that the local elections were not for them at all. The people that were in the local, who were councillors, they had no connection to them at all. And then running up to the EU referendum, I noticed that things started to really change. And the women became really interested in the EU debate. Really interested, to the point where we were meeting every day, and and they were updating me with what they knew. And I remember one day David Beckham came out and said something about Brexit, and he was talking about he supported Remain or whatever. And I remember the women said to me, they were calling him an absolute bastard, saying, who does he think he is? Telling us to vote one way or the other. Does he have to worry about housing apart from which one he lives in? And I remember them being absolutely incensed over David Beckham telling them what to do. And I remember, do you remember a point in the EU, where in the referendum, when the website went down? It crashed. And so they gave it an extra week so you could register. So they gave it an extra week, and when thousands and thousands of people registered. Well, this was the point when the women that I was involved with registered to vote. They had not registered to vote before and not voted on anything, but they registered in that week that it was extended. And I remember listening to the news, and I remember sort of David Cameron saying, all these thousands of people have registered to vote, it's definitely going to be Remain. And I remember laughing, thinking, you have no clue what is going on out there. So, and I remember the day before the referendum, and I remember talking to this group of women who were white and mixed race women. And I remember talking to them about these debates around Brexit and what it meant. And what they picked up on is the fact that they, as working class women, their voices were not being listened to. And actually, they were being demeaned. And they'd read all the stories in the newspaper about people voting for Brexit as stupid and racist and thick. and don't know what they're voting for. And they were aware of these debates, and they were very angry about those debates. And I remember saying to them, and we were talking about sort of the area in Bethnal Green, and I remember saying to them, you know that, and we were talking, and they were talking about, some of them were talking about what it was like to be white and working class in Bethnal Green. And I remember just mentioning to one of them and saying, you know that there's a school of thought that white working class people, it's not a thing and it doesn't exist. And she said, well, that's a shame, really, for all them, because all us who don't exist are voting out tomorrow. And I thought that was really poignant. And the next day, they all voted, and they were really proud of that vote. And the day after, I saw them again, you know, and they were, you know, they were elated. And so, what really I want to talk, what my point is with this is, whether or not we like it, what it did is it engaged people in a political debate that actually was not there previously. It was not there. And I'd worked, so my research was not about Brexit, although because I'd spent so much time with them, that's, you know, that was part of the research that happened. I then went to, because I thought this was really interesting, I went up to Nottinghamshire, where I come from, and I started doing research, which I've just finished, well, actually this month I'll finish it, in the Nottinghamshire coalfields, in the ex-mining communities. And yet again, there was this feeling and this idea that the people there just don't exist, and that they didn't exist to the people in London. And one of the reasons they gave me for voting Brexit, these were all working class people, was because they wanted to ruin the party here in London. And I think, again, that's something what's not been picked up on, these sort of spatial differentials, these inequalities that are totally spatial. That the idea up in the deindustrial areas that the South East has been having this great big party that they've not been invited to. And actually what they did see as their vote was ending this party here. And I think, you know, to not take that seriously and to not take those women's voices and men's voices that I was working with in Nottinghamshire seriously is actually a massive mistake. And so, you know, whatever happens now, we had this window of opportunity, I think, where we started to talk about inequality. We started to talk about what was happening in the north of England and in the Midlands and why people were feeling so left out. But it appears to me that that window has closed again, and where we are now is back into this debate around sort of technocratic and bureaucratic language that actually doesn't include these men and women again. And I suppose this is a word of warning, you know, ignore those voices at your peril. Because in my opinion, we are lucky that those people only use their vote to tell us how angry they are. And perhaps next time they might not just use the vote. And so I suppose that's my argument for not having a second referendum or a people's vote. Because to dismiss people's voices that did think long and hard about this would be a mistake.
Okay, I know talking to people who have done work in Wales, I guess you may have something to say on this, similar kind of messages come up, and also people who have been, were canvassing in Bristol, in Hartcliffe and other areas of Bristol, similar ideas about how people were feeling empowered by voting leave. We'll come back to that anyway. I'll pass over to Rachel, who may not want to take on that particular question just at the moment, but perhaps if you could say.
Certainly I'm talking about space, but what I'd like to talk about is political space, really. And it's, I'd like to highlight a few points that I've drawn from my research into the UK as a gender equality actor, and also more recently my research into Brexit and devolution within the UK. And there are a few points that I want to highlight that really kind of front and centre, that the thread that I would like to pull through my contribution today is really highlighting that we are in a post-devolution UK now. So there are multiple political spaces within the UK. So since the late 1990s, we've seen the transfer of lawmaking power from London to Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So, for example, in Wales, Wales has the capacity to create laws in the area of health, education, agriculture, and the environment. And we've seen political institutions kind of develop and also be established. There are distinct legislatures. There are vibrant civil societies that are organised around these political spaces within the UK. And this is something that I think is really important that we acknowledge in our thinking about gender and Brexit. So whether one voted leave or whether one voted remain, it's important analytically to inform our research and our thinking. And it's also important politically because it will inform the ways in which we engage with the political institutions and which political institutions we're talking with and when. So this is what I want to highlight today. So 3 different points that I could present in whichever order. The first is to acknowledge that there are different approaches to gender equality in the different territories within the UK. So we have the different governments in the UK have got different ways to address gender equality, different gender equality objectives. They mobilise policies in different ways. And we can see this through, for example, the ways that equality is or isn't embedded within devolution legislation, the childcare policies, the representation of women within the legislatures as well. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge when we think about government's objectives and kind of pathways towards equality, there's not just one government and there's not just one voice. There are multiple voices. And something I like to tack on to the end of this is that there are certain governments in the UK as well who are actually more or less hospitable to wanting to listen to gender equality concerns and take gender equality concerns on board. Now, at the risk of painting Wales as being this perfectly rosy place, which it certainly is not, it is worth highlighting that, say, on International Women's Day this year, we had the First Minister of Wales saying that what he wants is a feminist government in Wales. And there is currently a gender equality review underway in order to aim to bring that into effect. So again, I think this is really worth, when we're thinking about the future of gender equality post-Brexit, that we keep this political differentiation in mind. So that's the first point, the relevance of devolution when we think about gender equality. The second point, and this is something that we don't see enough in the political and public debate around Brexit, is that Brexit is going to play out differently in the different territories and the different nations of the UK. And that's because there's not solely one relationship between the UK and the European Union. There are multiple relationships between Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and the European Union. And these relationships reflect the devolution settlement, they reflect the key industries in these devolved nations, the socio-economic status, and also the political priorities of the governments that are in power and have been in power. So this means that Brexit is going to play out differently. And as we were speaking earlier today, we know that as I will argue, there will be gendered, the implications of Brexit will be gendered. And so it's very important when we think about how financially, economically, politically, how Brexit will look different in the different nations of the UK. This also means that the gendered implications will be different as well. So this is something we need to keep forward in our thinking. So the last point I want to make is really kind of zooming out and thinking about the European Union as a political space. And this just speaks to some work I've been doing with Paul Copeland from Queen Mary University, where we've been looking at European networks and the different ways in which UK-based actors engage with those networks. And in particular, we've looked at civil society organisations, and we've looked at women's organisations, those working in the women's sector. And what we found from our research is that UK-based actors working in the women's sector kind of use that European space to great effect. So they use it as a backdrop to exchange information, to get policy ideas, to raise the profile of what they're doing, to build relationships in order to undertake joint projects and to access European funding, and also as a means to influence policy and undertake transnational advocacy work. So that European space for gender equality advocates has been very valuable. Now, what is important, and I want to stress here, is that for actors from the devolved administrations, there is a particular significance to this European space, because this European space has allowed them to act as distinct actors, independent from that UK centre, which has meant that they've been able to engage, access resource that they can bring back to inform their own domestic agenda, and also highlight the distinct priorities of the devolved nations within the European Union. So this is the point that I'm going to leave you, and the take-home message here is that really when we think about gender equality in the UK, we need to be sensitive to devolution. When we think about Brexit, we need to be sensitive to devolution. And so this is kind of like analytically the starting point that I hope will kind of inform some of our discussion. Thank you.
Vivienne.
Thank you, and thank you to Dan and Roberta for inviting me today. Brexit and gender translates to me as Brexit and women's rights. Although the word gender is now commonly used, for many of us in the women's voluntary and community sector, our concern is actually sex-based protections and women's human rights. And so I just want to say that because sometimes it gets lost in the debates when we use the word gender, which is actually a social construct. So I think we need to bear that in mind. As the Chief Executive of the Women's Resource Centre, which is the national umbrella body for little women's charities and groups all over the country, obviously my concern is about those groups and organisations. We estimate there's approximately 20,000 across the country, and they work with millions of women every year. And I believe that those organisations are the unsung sheroes. I say sheroes because I like to feminise my language, in the struggle for women's rights, who have been and still are at the forefront of both advancing and protecting our rights. And you don't have to take my word for it, you can do research on that, find out how rape in marriage became illegal in 1991, and how many other laws have been changed, and it is predominantly women-only, independent, collective action that has achieved our rights of women. But additionally to campaigning, women's organisations provide services to women. And I really liked what you said about ethnography. I can't say it properly. Because women's orgs are ethnographers. They work with women year in, year out, and they collect their stories and evidence. And then they share that with us, and that's how we come to understand what the strategic overriding issues of concern around women's rights are. Not only that, women's organisations, they politicise women, because a women's organisation historically and at its best, is built upon a framework of understanding the institutional discrimination of women. That's where we start from. And so when women access services for domestic violence or rape, anything else, those women, and from my experience of working frontline, women always think it's just them. They did something wrong. What happened is my fault. But as a women's organisation, we're able to contextualise their experiences within a much wider societal framework of institutional oppression, which is built in across every aspect of our lives. And within that, those women are liberated to understand their experience not as an individual failure, but part of a sexist society. And then they become politicised in wanting to shift that. I am very, very concerned about the potential impacts of Brexit on women and women's organisations. I don't think the two are kind of inseparable if we're talking about women's rights. But before I go on to that, I just want to set the scene of what was happening before Brexit. I'm sure other speakers have talked about austerity, and we know that women are paying for 80% or more of the cuts as a result of austerity. We know that. It's been evidenced by many different people. We also know that within that, it is the poorest women who are paying the biggest price for the failures of the male bankers. So we're talking about black and minoritised women. We're talking about disabled women. And I'm sure you know from newspaper stories that actually some disabled people have died as a result of austerity. You know, so this is not just a kind of academic discussion. These policies of government have massively detrimental and in some cases life and death impacts. We also know that during austerity, from our own research of our 500 members, that women's organisations, whilst having less money to provide services to women in need, have seen almost an 80% increase in demand. So our sector is in crisis. There is no doubt about that. And as you probably know, that 2 women a week are murdered by a current or former partner in this country. And the ones that we know of, 80,000 women are raped every year. What we also know from the recent Women and Equality Select Committee inquiry is that the levels of sexual harassment and violence in schools is going through the roof. I don't know if any of you saw the horrendous piece, which I saw on Twitter this week, of a 6-year-old girl being raped in a playground whilst adults were there. The problem that we have is that we are not prepared to acknowledge the endemic levels of violence against women and girls in this country. Because if we did, when those teachers noticed the girl standing with her knickers down, they wouldn't have asked her why her knickers were down. They would have wondered, has something happened to this girl? We are failing our children. Alongside this, we also have so-called gender-neutral policy making, which in practice is sexist policy making. Because if we acknowledge that we live in a patriarchal society, then the policies that are made without paying any attention to the different impacts of them on men and women will favour men, because that's the default position. That's not helping women or our organisations. So we already were in a very precarious predicament in terms of women's organisations, services to women, and our ability to campaign to protect our rights. So with Brexit now, how I saw Brexit, and I would like to have a discussion with you because I don't agree with some of the points that you've made. I agree that the working class, I'm a working class woman, are ignored. We don't count, we're the scum of the earth, and as long as we're there for work fodder at any price, that's all good. And I'm also from the north, and I know that the north feels completely, unless you're middle class of course, completely separated from any influence on government. But I think that's also part of something else that's happening, and how we're not educated to engage in processes. Anyway, I'll come back to that later. But for me, the Leave campaign was appalling. It was based on racist, anti-immigration rhetoric. And the evidence of that post the vote is the massive spike in racist violence. So Tell Mama reported, I think, nearly 50% increase in attacks predominantly by white men on visibly Muslim women. They're not the only ones. I live in inner London, in a really diverse part of town, and friends of mine, black women, have been verbally abused and had things thrown at them from cars. And we're talking about a place near Brixton. That is unheard of. That has never happened since they were children, when their parents came to this country with the Windrush. So what we have now is the unleashing of the hitherto lid on the bubbling racism of many people in this country, and an emboldened approach to actually expressing those views. So some of the organisations we work with who work with black minoritised migrant women are absolutely inundated with women asking for help. And it's across such a multitude of issues, they can hardly cope with that. At the same time, those same organisations are being closed down. So we are in a crisis. Not only the kind of narrative of the country, whether we leave or we don't leave, is almost irrelevant, because that narrative has been unleashed and it is with us now. But in terms of the rights that women enjoy as a result of membership of the EU, it is of concern to women's organisations, because there are many that have supported us. Now, if we had a government that we could rely on to protect our rights domestically when leaving the EU, perhaps that wouldn't matter. But there is not one drop of evidence that suggests that the current government is going to prioritise the rights of over half the population. And so we are very, very worried and we are very concerned. I would like to talk at some point about what we're going to do about this, because I think my sector, the women's sector, has always spearheaded solution-focused ways forward. And so we want to engage with academics, lawyers, etc., who are of the same mind of us. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, certainly. Perhaps when we're recapping at the end, I'd ask you all to think about ways forward and how we try to get some positive steps forward. Perhaps you can start to prepare your questions while I just say that for me, what those three presentations, very brief presentations, showed was the extent of the gaps, in this very disunited kingdom. These gaps, and we talked about some of this morning in terms of things, resources, networks, funding, rights that we perhaps took for granted as a member of the European Union, and which we now stand to lose. So questions about how we try to bridge some of those gaps, which started, I suppose, before lunch. Some of the gaps that particularly, Lisa, you were talking about, gaps in terms of social divisions, which Pfizer was also talking about this morning, growing inequalities and a sense of polarisation as well, that it's not just about inequalities, but groups of people not talking to each other. And then thirdly, political gaps, that is, the way in which the political situation and politicians, so, you know, as various people have pointed out, and particularly you, Marianne, this morning, you know, there is political agency in all of this, that there are political choices made which exacerbate, amplify these divisions and even create more of them. So I'll ask you all to reflect on these and perhaps think about how, you know, how we can try and find ways of bridging some of these gaps. Questions, comments, please, from the floor to shut me up. Oh, Marianne first and then Roberta. Anybody else? Well, okay, Margaret.
Hi, I thought that was a really brilliant panel. Thank you very much. I really wanted to follow up on the points that Lisa was making about, well, all the panel really. And it's this question for me about how do we deal with the situation we're now in? Because there is a group of people who, and I understand, you know, the Leave vote is complicated. Some of it was about race, some of it wasn't. Some of it was about feeling in a system that doesn't work for you, why should you care when people say, if you vote Leave, the system will collapse? Well, the system doesn't work for me, so, you know. And those people are going to feel betrayed whatever happens, because the Brexit that they thought they were getting is not going to be the Brexit that they're going to get. And with the best will in the world, they are likely to be the people who suffer the most from whatever changes to trading arrangements that we have. And we have this narrative of, you know, it would have been a good Brexit if it had been done properly, or things, you know, we've been betrayed, or, you know, and that really worries me greatly when you've got people who already feel betrayed, who voted for something that they thought might bring about some sort of change that doesn't bring about the change that they wanted. And then there's other people still saying, actually, well, it would have done, but you were betrayed, you know. And, you know, newspapers accusing MPs of treachery, let alone everybody else. And I suppose my question is, how do we move on from here? You know, what do we do to deal with the fact that we've got, you know, two separate economic and political crises? You know, you could resolve the economic problems by not doing Brexit, but that doesn't deal with the, you know, the political crisis that would cause. I think makes that very difficult, and the social crisis.
It's a social crisis, actually. Yes. That's where I would say.
The social crisis and the related political crisis that would cause. And I suppose when I think about it too closely, I find myself getting very, very, very anxious about the times we're in and the direction which we're headed with, you know, the rise of the right across Europe and this situation. What do we do about it?
Can we hold that and maybe take 3 questions then, Margaret and Roberta next.
Hi, thank you. 3 really great presentations. And I have a question both for Lisa and one for Rachel and Vivienne together. So for Lisa, actually, what you're finding really reflects onto some of the free-form comments we had in our own survey and, you know, the issue of anger, etc. But one of the things I didn't get to talk about earlier today, but I would be really interested to know what you found from the ethnographic work. Who were the interlocutors for these women? Who did they talk about the vote and Brexit, etc.? Where did they get the information? Because that actually also matters in terms of political activation and engagement and the quality of engagement. And in terms of the civil society side, is there a move towards a greater, collaboration, a greater collaboration perhaps between different civil society groups in the devolved nations, but also kind of, is there a mobilizing that is taking place to think about these issues in an intersectional way, to also then kind of bridge this kind of gap, which Lisa was addressing in her presentation? Thank you.
Just take, at the front here, just take one more question and give you a chance to respond.
Yeah, it's difficult to formulate a question because I want to respond to so much of what's been said, but particularly it's so important following up conversations over lunch to talk about different positions that women of different classes and races and citizenship status are actually in at the moment. And also to say that what I've taken from the panel is a reminder of how it's about the nature of, where are women? Where is the analysis of gender and power in our thinking about democracy and democratic institutions, in which so many of us have lost faith, including many women who perhaps never had faith in them in the first place. And what can we do? Well, in a small way, in Bristol, we've already organised a symposium which brought together women from 4 nations and had the theme of looking at activists working alongside researchers and people involved in the policy process. And we're going to follow that up with a specific event to try to involve migrant women and BEM women and EU nationals to look at how can we work together as researchers and activists to monitor what's happening. We heard a lot about, through the hostile environment, so many women have been excluded from services unnecessarily already. And so this is going to be an ongoing issue to monitor and try to work together as service providers and researchers and campaigners to see what we can do about this.
Okay. Shall we go in the same order? Do you want to go first, Lisa?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I suppose I'm talking particularly about this part, because this is only a small part of the research. I worked for 4 years with this group of women, so actually the key issues with those women was around housing. So that was the work that I was doing. I was doing housing. The politics and then Brexit was just part of that. So I'm just picking on this one sort of particular thing because we're at this seminar today. But I think what I'm trying to do here is example the complexity of where we are, but also draw on austerity. What has happened over the last 8-9 years in the country, the way that divisions have been sown deeper and deeper and deeper, but also the ongoing inequalities relating to class, which is not about 8 years, it's about 200 years or 300 years. And these class divisions are extremely deep, and people miss them. And so where we are is extremely complicated and complex, and it worries me greatly. And I think going back to what you said, thinking about power and gender, and the way, but not only to power and gender, but power, gender and class, the way that power is now in the hands of very few people, the way that inequality is playing out in employment. I learned last week that the most elite work in Britain, I mean, everything, sort of the top 7% are having a great time in Britain at the moment. The most elite jobs is in the medical profession, but the second most elite job is an actor, is acting. And so, the range of inequality is really wide. And I really think that for Brexit, we think that we can tackle this, on an economic level. But actually, people mostly voted viscerally. They voted on feelings and how they felt and how hurt they were and how angry they were. And so I think, the last panel really, the way that we keep talking about the economic, and, you said it yourself, these are people who are going to, suffer in Brexit. Well, that's not, they didn't vote on that. They voted on the feelings of unfairness. And Brexit was not the right place for them to do that. Brexit is not going to solve any of that. And so, yes, I fear absolutely what is coming. But still, I think we missed an opportunity to talk about inequality and to talk about unfairness And instead we've moved back into bureaucracy, and you know how this trade deal is going to work and how this trade, and that is all that is coming out. And actually people all over the country now are just feeling that it's more unfair, because the Brexit they thought they wanted, or the Brexit they thought that might help them, is technocratic. And I don't know where we're going with this. I really, really don't. I mean, we look over at Europe. I mean, and that's the other sort of dilemma. We're talking, a lot of people who want to remain say, the EU is a great place, and actually that's not true either. I was at a conference in Brussels in February. In Brussels, Brussels are more worried about what's happening in Italy and Poland than what's happening in the UK. And so I think, where we are is not about sovereignty for most people. For some people it is. But for most people it's about massive inequalities. And I don't know, Brexit is not going to solve that now or ever. But I still think that a second referendum would put fuel to a fire, and I don't think it's the right thing.
Well, I feel quite small having to follow that wonderful response. So in terms of the question you asked, I think I feel the same levels of anxiety as you do. I think though so I'm not able to answer to provide a response. I think it's important to remember, though, as an academic, as researchers in the room, is that we continue to do our gender-sensitive analysis. We make sure that is there, that it's available, and also, obviously, from the position of being based in Wales, that is devolution sensitive as well, and understands that there are, distinct Brexit stories. At the same time, I think what's very important, but this is a kind of a civil and a political project, is, as was mentioned in the previous panel, is really having a discussion about what winning looks like. So regardless of Leave and Remain, so what do we understand by kind of the future of equality? What do we want to see in the UK in future? So those would be my two kind of very obvious responses to that question. With respect to Roberta's question around the mobilisation of civil society organisations, certainly we have seen within Wales there's been a certain mobilisation. There are networks that have been established to bring together different representatives from, actually women representatives from different backgrounds, from different organisations. There's also more broadly a network of civil society organisations that are seeking to kind of identify what the key issues are for them and how they might participate within the decision-making process. I think what's really important to note here is that we're talking about organisations that are already massively under-resourced. So it's very, very difficult for them to be able to, say, spare somebody for an afternoon or a morning to attend a workshop, or to invest time in reading policy documents, for example. So I think that there has to be an understanding of the practical constraints within which these civil society organisations are working. And as a final point, slightly on a tangent, when I was speaking about the way UK-based civil society organisations have engaged in this European level, now, Brexit doesn't mean an end to that access. It will likely mean a reconfiguration to that access. And certainly in the research I've done, there's a willingness and a desire with respect to our European counterparts that UK-based actors continue to participate within these networks. However, obviously, other issues rise to the top, which is who funds this. So this is where governments need to think about, again, how do they support gender equality actors in a new post-Brexit situation? And also, obviously, the different legal and political architecture that we'll be working within post-Brexit. So in terms of civil society organisations, I think it's important to emphasise that European dimension will still be there, but it will kind of have an effect in a different way.
Thank you.
Okay. A lot of great questions and more of a discussion, I think, than a set of answers. I think civil society, in answer to Roberta's question, does need to get more collaborative. I think it is getting more collaborative. I think particularly around specific issues, so violence against women and girls, there are quite strong connections between rape crisis centres and women's aid organisations across the devolved nations, and they work hard to stay in contact and work together on things and do joint campaigns. My organisation, I think it's 8 years ago, we facilitated the first ever consortium of 30 violence against women and girls organisations in London. And the real driver to doing that was in response to competitive tendering, which you may or may not know about, but it basically shuts out small local women's orgs from accessing funding because of the system of the way they do it. So we brought these orgs together so that we could access some of those bigger pots of money, and we have maintained a diverse provision across London because of that, and some organisations have stayed alive because of that. I do think, we're sitting here a predominantly white audience and probably reasonably well educated, so we're not representative of the country by any means. And I think, from my studies many years ago, we always, and I have to thank sociology for this, we always looked at race, class and sex as the key components to analysing anything, and I still stand by that. Obviously nowadays it's called intersectional, but it's kind of, for me, a similar thing. I think the example you gave of Bristol is the kind of things we need to be doing, is getting together, basically, and perhaps going back to the early days of the women's liberation movement, where consciousness raising, as it was called, was critical. And that goes back to some of the kind of peer self-education of women to identify their issues, to talk about them, and to think about solutions. But of course, with what I see is a deliberate attempt to dismantle women's rights organisation by this government, then those spaces are shrinking. Because a lot of those orgs and groups are local, and they work with communities of interest across race and class, they have a reach that nobody else has. They have that potential. And I think that's part of the reason that the government is dismantling us, because we represent and we achieve change for women. And let's not forget, change for all women across all groups of women is good for society. Men and white people should not be afraid of people having their rights met. Yes, we may have to give up something and share, but it's actually good for society to do this. It's a benefit. So we need to stop being afraid of change in terms of rights and equality. So I would say, if you want to hold on to some of the stuff that we have had, then you need to put your hands in your pockets and give some money to your local women's organisation.
Okay, we've got a few more questions. Could I just say before I forget, because we've talked a bit about funding, and the government is apparently launching a consultation on the Shared Prosperity Fund, which is the initiative which is meant to replace the EU funding. And that consultation, I think, is going to be launched in November. So everybody here, I presume, has an interest in all of these questions. You need to be looking out for that. And we need women and those involved in organisations and those doing research on this to put in evidence and and really make a case, because if you read the government report on this subject, it's got very little, if anything, I think, to say about women's experiences. Okay, so I noticed a hand at the very back, and here, was there somebody else? There was someone else over there, maybe? But you go first. I've got you as well.
I'd just like to say that I am actually very excited by Brexit. I've worked in my life, I've worked with asylum seekers, and I've worked in women's refugees over the years, a long time ago. I've worked in all various areas like that. And I have a slightly different view about all this, I think, than most people. I'm very interested that we know that the referendum vote was neutral. Women and men voted equally in that vote. And also, we've heard from Lisa that she's spoken to a group of women who clearly became engaged politically in the light of the vote and voted, made their decisions and chose to vote. And I think that what I find surprising, and I'd be interested to know what people think about this, is there seems to me to be a real kind of feeling that these women didn't know what they were doing. You know, clearly there's research which has been done which has suggested that they didn't really know. And I find that very, very surprising, and I wonder why that is. I wonder why, when we hear from Lisa that these women voted leave, the question that comes from the audience is, yes, but where did they get the information from? What newspapers were they reading? Where did they get that from? As if there is some right place to get the information, and that they weren't capable of disseminating that themselves. And I find that very depressing, and I wonder why that is. The other thing that I'd like to say is on the immigration point, I was really heartened by the reaction of everybody to the Windrush scandal. I think the Brexit vote has actually unleashed a lot of discussion about things which we can now talk about openly, which we weren't talking about before. And we need to get out there, and people need to voice what they think. They need to start speaking. The Daily Mail was against Windrush. Most people that heard about that were horrified. And I think there's going to be positive things, and I'm very excited. And I wonder why we're so sceptical. Thanks.
Yeah, Hilary again. Yes, I mean, I think that the point perhaps that I made this morning about informal and invisible economies becomes even more important in the respect of space and place and diversity. And I don't think anybody's got any answers to that yet. We're only looking at formal economies, and we're going to have to move on pretty pronto, because perhaps several of the issues that have arisen come from that. But more importantly, at the moment, in respect of place, I live in Liverpool and have done for many, many years. Most of our MPs are women. Liverpool voted 65% to stay, and 90 out of 92 or something councillors in our city council have just repeated that and insisted that we should stay. I'm a bit fed up with the story about the North voted this way and the South voted another way, and we all hate people in London. It is true. Not many people in Liverpool have been to London. I'm much an exception. But it is not true that everybody hates everybody else. And I think I would even go so far as to say, and we also have women MEPs, that sometimes the women will stand up and say things that the men are a bit more quiet about, proportionately to the ratio of gender of that particular occupation. I'm not claiming it as a whole thing, but proportionate to that. And we've got to be a bit more, I mean, you can't get much more desperate than Liverpool was 20, 30 years ago. But we got objective one, and people actually pointed that out. And the result is we are firmly, even more firmly than before, for Remain. And we're a bit fed up. I can talk about many, many councillors, I know the political situation in Liverpool very well, who don't want to hear these stories. I mean, I accept totally that they're valid, and I understand why they've come about, but there is another story too, if that makes sense.
I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to express this very well, but thank you very much. I loved hearing all about the women's things, which I feel very strongly about, because equally violence against women does not remain in one class system, one colour system, one everything. So my problem that I am having as I get older, and as all this discussion, is that too many of us, too many people in England, put people into boxes Why is it necessary for just about everything we do to have to answer what colour we are, or what, I mean, the sex I can understand to some extent, because that obviously, you know, are you male, female, or other? But not, are you, you know, gay, not gay, whatever, etc., etc. Why are we being put into boxes? We are basically all human beings, all identical. And we should actually do more of us, should take time to talk to everybody, anybody. The other day, somebody said to me that she only meets people at the school gates or in her office. She never talks to anyone outside those milieus. And I went, well, what about on the tube? You know, what about the homeless person in the street? And she said, oh, I couldn't talk to them. Well, why not? And part of it is because we are being put the whole time into boxes. And it may be my age thing, but I refuse now to say what I am. I am a human being. That's it.
So let's just take those two. If we take yours and then this gentleman over here.
I just wanted to quickly add another dimension and go back to what we were saying about what the vision was and you know, before lunch and what do we want and how much do we want to have the opportunity to shake this all up. I'm from Northern Ireland, and we also would be working with women in the south. Research that was published last week found that only full alignment on the island of Ireland will meet the needs that are being expressed by people in the north in terms of going forward. If that then means that there's special accommodation for Northern Ireland, can that be built on across all 5 nations in order to, well, essentially secure the international agreement, human rights agreement, which is in the Good Friday Agreement? And can we look to using that to secure a higher and better extension of rights? And I say this, and it's just occurred to me, I don't know if there's anybody else from Northern Ireland here, but as a woman living in Northern Ireland, I will be a UK citizen after Brexit. I will also remain an EU citizen through my Irish passport. And in that situation, I will have poorer protection in reproductive care and rights, in employment, and in protection against discrimination in the exercise of public function already, just to name a few. So we desperately need to look at the 5-nation approach, I think, to how we go forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Last word.
Thank you. My name's Colin. I work for one of the MEPs in London. It's a lady, Mary Honeyball. And I've been a political activist probably best part of 20 years. In response to what Lisa and Vivienne said about this, very much this anger that was manifest in a vote to leave, I did a lot of campaigning before Brexit, probably a good month or two, probably talked to thousands of people because we were going out in teams right across South London, East London, North, everywhere. And within about a week, 10 days before, I was quite convinced that the vote was going to go the way it went. You could feel that. I've worked in campaigns for MPs, for local elections, so I have a lot of experience, and you feel the vote. And I remember engaging, especially in South London, with people who would normally vote for my party, imagine which one it is. And then we had the conversation about Brexit, and they were going to vote to leave. And I couldn't understand this, and it was about their own interests. They saw, especially people coming from abroad, as a challenge to their jobs, or they just felt that they would be better off leaving. Now, I think they're wrong. I was convinced they're wrong. I don't see how they can be better off when we leave the EU. I just don't see that. But I can see their anger, and it was clear where their anger was coming from. I'm just wondering, well, what's going to happen now when we leave? Because I'm presuming we leave. I don't think we're going to get a second vote. I think the government won't allow that. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on where this anger goes now. Okay, they were angry with the status quo. They were possibly angry with David Cameron and his pals. But nothing's going to be resolved. Where's that anger going to go now is my question. What's going to happen next?
Okay, so I think we wrap up the session, and perhaps I'll start with you, Vivienne, this time. Is that all right?
Yeah.
Not to put you on the spot or anything, but just to mix it up.
Yeah, I think, yes, we're guilty of making generalisations, absolutely, and it's difficult not to. And of course, nothing is that straightforward. It's quite nuanced. So I just want to acknowledge that. And of course, not all working class people did vote leave. The woman who said she's excited by Brexit, well, I hope your excitement bears fruit. And I would love to share that with you and be more optimistic. I'm not sure that we can link the successes around the Windrush scandal to the referendum. Runnymede, a charity, has worked tirelessly for a very long time on that, so I don't know about which things impacted on it. I wanted to come back to your point about putting people in boxes, which is problematic because often that's done in order to support stereotypes of people. That is problematic. However, in terms of struggles for our rights as women and also the rights of black people, we need the data so that we know what's happening. If we don't have the data that says, you know, women across the board have paid for 80% of Brexit, then we haven't got the evidence to say politicians and policy makers need to do this. So from our point of view, data is really, really important, but it should not be used to stereotype people. Yeah, that's all I've got to say.
Well, thank you for that set of questions. The first point tonight, and I will let's approach this as an academic, if we're thinking about, you know, men and women who voted Leave or Remain, I think it's important that we understand, you know, regardless of whether you voted Leave or Remain, we need to understand, get as much information as we can about what economically, financially, politically, what will be the implications of Brexit. So we can, I say, let's leave aside those kind of holding very firm to this was a right decision or this was a wrong decision when we're doing this research. We need to understand the different ways in which the European Union has impacted on the promotion of gender equality within the UK. We need to understand that just so post-Brexit we can have a better understanding of the kind of strategy that needs to be put in place to continue to, or to work towards advancing gender equality and also other equality. So I hope that actually when you're listening to some of this discussion, it isn't just because one is raising the issue of gender and Brexit, it doesn't come from a point of just being hateful towards people who voted Leave at all. We just need to understand this new post-Brexit context. The other point I want to say, yes, I'm very sympathetic with your response, is that in order to understand, as we said before, structural inequality, so, you know, why do we only have, say, you know, 20% of parliamentarians, about 20% of women as parliamentarians? We need to have that data. So we need to understand where people are and what their backgrounds are, just to give us a starting point to thinking about the different inequalities that have resulted in that. And I appreciate that there is a concern about the ways in which this data can be used and the categorization of people. But I think at the moment having that information is of huge value. The other point I wanted to make about the potential future relationship between the UK and the European Union, obviously, when it comes to the border between Ireland and Northern Ireland, that is, it's be trite of me to say it's a very challenging issue. It certainly is a challenging issue, and it's highly political on the UK side and highly political on the European side, obviously. as the European Union has very much taken, Ireland is centre stage when it comes to these discussions. And obviously in the UK, this is very challenging because we have a political situation, which means that in many ways having a distinctive relationship between Northern Ireland and mainland Britain would be untenable. So I'm afraid I can't really offer an outcome and with respect to this question, because we will see, I imagine, over the coming 6 weeks, the kind of relationship that will be established in order to overcome what is at times seem very much like an intractable issue. Thank you for the question.
I suppose I want to come back to this question really around power, and particularly power and politics. We were talking about, so the women that I was working with for 4 years didn't vote for any local or national election running up to the European Union vote. And actually the election that was in 2017, they didn't vote in that either. So there is a massive, so the disconnect for me really is about between those women and actually the levers of power. And they don't see, this place as working for them. And this is exactly what I found in Nottinghamshire as well. And the thing is, and I think, just to sort of wrap up my ideas, if you don't want Brexit, and if you think Brexit is a bad idea, stop talking about it. What you need to start talking about is solidarity with those people that have lost their communities and lost their homes and lost their jobs, who's, because of austerity, are carrying the biggest burden for the bankers. What you need to start to talk about is solidarity with those people, not about how Brexit's going to hurt them, because they are not listening to you. They was not listening to you when the vote happened, and they're not listening now. Because there is no solidarity with them. You're not showing that you actually are interested in their situation. And so, do people in the north hate people in London? No, of course they don't. But do people feel that Westminster and the media and the arts and medicine and law, do they think that those structures are not there for them and are not working for them? Yes, they do think that. And so I suppose my final comments is stop talking about Brexit. Stop it. Stop talking about, and especially the economics of it and the trade deals, and I know these things have to be talked about. Stop preaching. How are you going to make that argument with Sally, with a woman in my research, who had her money caught by the social because her eldest child got to 5 and she didn't get a job quick enough. And what she did, she was told she needed to manage her money better. They sent her on a training course to manage her money better. Do you know what she did? And she was really proud of this. And I hope none of you start feeling sorry for her, because she doesn't feel sorry for herself. She was proud. What she did is she taught herself to only eat every 2 days, so her kids could eat. Now, how are you going to argue with her, and she voted to leave? How are you going to vote with her when I asked her and I said, do you think your situation is going to get better if we leave the EU? And she said no, but I just can't stand it being the same. How are you going to argue with that? So what my advice is you start talking about solidarity with those people and stop talking at them about why they are wrong.
Great place to end this session, I think. But not the conversation, and I would really like us, we're going to be talking about next steps, I think, in the final session. I'd like us to start thinking about as well, how we take those issues forward, the housing and the solidarity issues. So thank you so much to our panellists. Really great.